Thanks, everyone in the room and outside of the room, putting up with the technical waiting. I'll give it away to Schnapp.
Everyone's in?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to IRIS NRC's International Film Club, Telling Global Stories, How US Policy Shapes Lives Around the World, with Pulitzer Center grantee Molly Knight Raskin. My name is Chanad Shikhosh. I am the Associate Director of the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, IRIS NRC for short. IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. We provide resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. Our partner today is the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, an award-winning nonprofit journalism organization which engages underreported global affairs by supporting quality international journalism and unique educational and outreach programs. For those joining via Zoom, Essie Lenchner will be running tech support. If you have any challenges, please use the chat function to contact her. We will be recording today's event and sharing the link in a post-event email. You will only show on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce Molly Knight Raskin. She's a journalist with more than 2 decades of experience writing, reporting, and producing for print, television, and documentary film. She has worked with some of the best in news, including the PBS NewsHour and the investigative documentary program FRONTLINE. Her documentary credits include series from Netflix, National Geographic, CNN, and A&E. Molly has received several journalism honors for her work reporting on global and mental health, including a Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism and multiple grants from the Pulitzer Center. She's also the author of the book No Better Time, The Brief Remarkable Life of Danny Lewin, the Genius Who Transformed the Internet, in 2013. Her recent documentary, Cuts and Consequences, The End of USAID, which is the focus of our film club today, has just been nominated for an Emmy. Many congratulations, Molly, on the nomination, and I will pass it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Will you put the slides? Oh, just so I know where I am.
Apologies, I thought I had it coming right up. You know how to get the slides here? I'm not sure how to get them on this big screen. I'm sorry, but hopefully I'll get these slides larger.
Will they be getting speaking? Will participants be getting speaking?
Yes.
Is that?
Yes, the view looks different for participants joining on Zoom.
Great. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. So my name is Molly Knight Raskin. Thank you very much for hosting me today, and thanks for attending and for your interest. I am here to speak about my reporting over the past year and a half on the end of USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And I'm here to talk a little bit about why I decided to do these stories, how we reported them and filmed them, and also about what we found when we went out to do the reporting. There's been a lot of coverage of the story. It obviously has very broad, sweeping implications in the world. And so our stories are just really a little slice of the impact of what's happened, but I hope that it gives you maybe some new perspective on the issue or new understanding. So you want to click to the first one. Just a brief primer, since a lot of people don't know a lot about what USAID did. The agency has been in existence since 1961, so it was founded by President Kennedy. And I have a list here of just some of the things that, in very basic terms, the agency did. But if you really simplify it, it was before the second Trump administration shut it down in January of 2025. It was the agency, the independent federal agency responsible for foreign and development aid across the world, the largest donor of that support in the world. So I believe USAID accounted for about 40% of the development and humanitarian aid. USAID worked in over 130 countries, so employed tens of thousands of people in countries, again, over 130, depending on the year and which countries needed more support, those priorities would shift. The work of USAID, again, spans both humanitarian, health, economic development. So it's pretty broad. The stories that we did focused on the global health piece of USAID. The reason for that is because when the agency was shut down, we wanted to look where we could at where the most immediate impact would be felt and what that would look like. And the most obvious programs for us to look at immediately to sort of be able to see both anecdotal and some empirical evidence were the health programs, where people were being delivered life-saving aid in many circumstances. And so, again, USAID was responsible for a lot of different programs, promoting democracy, economic development, education, offering people assistance for fair and democratic elections in a lot of countries around the world where there's a lot of instability, fragility, poverty, and disease. So basically, I say, to describe it, USAID really had a footprint in a lot of parts of the world where there really there isn't a lot of support. There's very little, maybe infrastructure. That infrastructure is at risk. People are internally displaced. Maybe they're refugees, they're in a conflict, or they're just in a part of the world that's extremely impoverished. And so really the reach is just vast. I want to go to the next one. Thank you. So as you may remember, in January of 2025, the second Trump administration made a pretty historic decision to end USAID. The decision was made by executive order. And it's important for me to just note that because the stories that we did in reporting on the impact of USAID were related directly to how the decision was made. So just to back up a little bit, the United States has historically been a very, very generous country. We're a wealthy country. We also are very generous. And so we've had this massive footprint through USAID over 6 decades. The agency itself pretty much enjoyed bipartisan support for 6 decades. There were, of course, between different administrations, different presidents, different policymakers, there were disagreements about how much money we should be giving, what that type of aid and support should look like, and where we should focus these interests of ours in supporting other countries. But overall, the agency as a whole, while there was some debate about whether or not to move it into the State Department, and that was kind of ongoing, pretty much remained, it was intact for 60 years. So the decision to shut it down overnight, when we heard this, again, as a journalist who I've spent a lot of my reporting time abroad in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the largest recipient of foreign aid in the world, as a region. And so I knew, and of course, everybody who has worked in humanitarian foreign aid, global health, is from some of these countries, has visited some of them, understood immediately that that decision overnight may have a serious impact. There may be serious repercussions. But what would they be? And so if you remember when this happened, we're talking about billions of dollars in aid, so very large amounts of money. I think it's important to note that although we were giving away a lot of money as a country and as this federal agency, it was only 1% of our GDP or of our national budget, federal budget. So that's important to note, only because a lot of people have the perception that because we're such a generous country, these numbers were much higher. But in reality, it was a very small portion of the budget per year. I think it amounted to about $24 a year for the American taxpayer. And so when this decision was made, you may remember that some of these headlines, and that's the reason that I put them on the slide up here. Some of the projections were really dire in the early moments, days, hours after this decision was made. Because again, the agency had such broad reach and was impacting so many different communities and programs all around the world. Devastating, catastrophic, millions could die, all of these headlines. The truth is, we didn't know at the time, and still we will never know the true impact of the end of USAID. And I can talk about why a little bit more later. But what we knew in that moment was that we were witnessing a massive shift in the way that the United States delivers this type of aid and support to foreign nations. And we knew that it had been cut overnight, again, very abruptly and without warning. So while we had on the one side, or in one arena of global health experts, we had these projections of how many people might die. And again, the numbers were staggering and high. Even if you took them and you broke them in half or fourth, still too many people to die unnecessarily. But we didn't know because we weren't on the ground in these communities, and these programs had been frozen. And there was mass chaos within the agency and the people who remained on staff or who had been terminated but had time to close out their programs. So basically, the idea of this film series and our reporting was to get away from these numbers, because that can feel very abstract to people when you're faced with kind of millions could die, but we don't really know. And so we had these huge numbers, and then we had people reporting little bits and pieces from all of these places all over the world. And then we had in Washington a pretty fierce debate starting to happen over how this happened overnight, why lawmakers were taken by surprise. You had lawmakers in both parties, although some more quietly than others, sort of raising a little bit of alarm about how this was carried out. So we decided to go to the communities themselves, or where we could go, to see what some of the initial impact of these cuts might be on the beneficiaries, on the people who live in the communities that were largely reliant on this funding that was coming from the United States government, but being delivered through partners on the ground. So NGOs, global NGOs, local NGOs. And so if you want to go to the next one. The other thing we didn't want to do was to get into what I was just talking about, the bigger kind of policy debates. I'm not a global health expert. And so, I understood going into this that there were very valid arguments on all sides of foreign aid and what the United States involvement should be, about how much we should be giving, where we should be giving it, how it should be given out. There were, of course, as you probably remember, accusations of fraud and corruption within the agency. But that wasn't our job. Our job was to take what the United States government was saying through Secretary of State Rubio, and I put this quote up on the screen because it's really important. As I mentioned before, we had the two facts that we could get at the time. We had the health experts, global health, humanitarian experts, health ministers in foreign countries saying, because of this, millions of people, tens of thousands of people, a lot of people could die or could suffer as a result, on the one hand. And we have the US government and the Secretary of State saying no one would die and no one will die, and very specifically, no child will die because of these cuts. So really our job was not to get into the deeper waters and debates about foreign aid and why we do it, but to go out and find out whether anybody had unnecessarily lost their lives. Were they suffering because of the way these programs were cut overnight? And so that's what we set out to do for the stories. How did we decide where to go? 130 plus countries, huge impact, very different in very different communities depending on the situation. So as I mentioned before, USAID responded and supported a lot of countries that were in the midst of humanitarian crises, some of the worst on the planet. And so we had to decide where to go, again, where we could look at the immediate impacts in a community that was reliant, fairly aid reliant, but also go somewhere that was safe for a camera crew, where the government of that country was allowing journalists in to document this. And we had to go somewhere where we could have the cooperation of sources on the ground. And that became a lot more challenging than we ever anticipated for reasons I could get more into. But am I going to the next one? So we decided to focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because it's the world's second largest beneficiary of USAID, or was at the time. Ukraine topped the list, but prior to that, Sub-Saharan Africa has long been the largest recipient of aid for reasons that probably you're all familiar with. As I mentioned earlier, the continent itself has immense poverty, conflict, bears the global burden of disease. And there are also a lot of brewing humanitarian crises or active humanitarian crises. So we knew that by going to sub-Saharan Africa and visiting one or two countries, we could at least get an idea of what was happening on the ground. So we chose two countries, one in East Africa and one in West. The reason for that, again, was really logistical part of it. Like, where could we get to safely, relatively easily, quickly get there, get on the ground, and also develop the sources in the communities that, you know, would be willing to speak to us. And so we chose Ghana and Kenya, both, you know, relatively stable countries, democracies, countries where there's been tremendous actually progress in development and health, in large part because of donors from not just the United States donations, but also other countries. So really working in cooperation with the US and USAID, both of these countries had made and have made really great strides in certain, you know, measurable areas, like things like maternal health or HIV/AIDS containment and treatment. So we chose to go to both. And I'm not sure what I have on the next slide, sorry, but okay, so the first country we went to was Ghana. We went to Ghana because Ghana has, in the capital around Accra, there's a fairly good health system, but like a lot of parts of the world, once you leave the main city and you get out into the rural, remote parts of the country, there are these vast healthcare deserts, if you will. I mean, so little access to care. And this is true in not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but in large parts of the world where there's a lot of poverty. So with the help of USAID, there had been, I think, a 5-year project to go in and strengthen the health system in the north of Ghana. So that's where we went. The program, which was a couple years into its launch, was supporting these community healthcare clinics. So there are these, I have a picture on the left, that's a very small healthcare clinic, but this is where pretty much everybody goes if they have a health issue in Ghana, in that region of Tamale in the north. They were receiving a lot of different benefits from this USAID program. They were receiving medical supplies for really basic needs like malaria protection, as I mentioned, HIV/AIDS. The clinics also were sourced with what women needed to deliver babies safely, so postpartum hemorrhage kits, which have been found to reduce the maternal mortality rate in regions that have really, really high rates of maternal mortality. Northern Ghana was one of them, but had again made great strides, in the past, 5 or so plus years in lowering that rate. In that region, it's also a victim to a lot of climate change issues. Access to clean water is a huge problem. So through the program, they also had several water projects going. So this was a region that really also we felt like could sort of demonstrate the ripple effect of aid in one particular region. So this program was specifically targeted towards strengthening the basic healthcare system, these community CHIPS clinics, they call them in Northern Ghana. However, it was also a way to look at the broader issue of why the United States was there and what were we doing there and why were we delivering aid to this community and what had we achieved. So we spent some time there visiting these clinics. And what we found was that, again, because the aid was shut down so quickly, the US government, if you remember, put a 90-day freeze on all aid at first. After that, the Secretary of State did say that they were issuing special waivers for life-saving programs, which was, at the time, I felt really heartened by that. And I thought, okay, well, maybe when we go out and report on this, we'll see that those programs are at least still up and running. And unfortunately, what we found was that was not the case. The life-saving waivers were issued in a way that was very chaotic and very inexplicable. They were made on a very rushed timeline that meant that no human being could have thoughtfully read through all of these proposals that were coming in from all over the world, trying to justify their programs as life-saving. So the suspicion is that they used AI or some kind of a computer program to select specific words and cut certain programs, because what we found in Kenya, which I'll get to in a minute, but was that, for example, I'll just give you one example of how some of these programs were cut. Nutrition programs in places with, acute malnutrition, where, refugees, very impoverished populations have a lack of access to food. There were cuts to World Food Programs because they had the word diversity in their explanation of what their program did. Because as a part of the End of USAID, one of the positions the government took was that we were going to remove any programs that were, devoted to anything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And while that may sound like at its face, okay, this is the way they're explaining it, and so if this is the way they're doing it, that's fine. However, the word diversity is used in a nutritional context to describe the diversity of the food that is being delivered to people within a certain region. So programs like the World Food Program use that word often to measure the efficacy of the aid that they're delivering and making sure that people are getting the kind of nutrition they need depending on what the setting is. So, for example, for people who live in a desert environment and don't have access to fruits and vegetables, are they getting enough vitamins? Is there enough nutritional diversity in the food aid that we are delivering. And those programs were cut, leading people to think maybe it was an accident. There were never really any answers. It was very, very chaotic and confusing, which was very problematic because, again, this we're talking about, people's lives. These programs, many of them were life-saving. So on the ground in Ghana, we found that a lot of these clinics that are already, as you can see, very spare, were facing supply shortages. So they had been receiving regular packages of very basic but life-saving medical supplies on a regular basis. And because of the way the aid, again, was cut off so abruptly, a lot of supplies got stuck because the funding was frozen. So there were, for example, ships that had large amounts of basic medical supplies or nutritional supplements that got stuck, that had to turn around, that sat at ports and rotted because there was no way to physically distribute those supplies, that food, that aid during that time frame when we were reporting. So by the time we got there in the spring, some of it had started to trickle back because they did turn back on or reinstate some programs, but it was kind of inexplicable what was being turned on and off again. And the definition of life-saving, as you might imagine, in a humanitarian aid context, is very difficult to make. What program is not life-saving, I think most people would say, but they really wanted, the metrics were not clear of like what was life-saving and what wasn't. So we found in Ghana that, again, they were lacking really some basic medical supplies to keep people safe and healthy. One of them, for example, that we looked at were insecticide-treated mosquito nets. It's such a simple, cost-effective way to control malaria. Malaria is the #1 killer of children under 5 on the continent. And, when we got there, we saw, like, in some cases, empty boxes in some clinics. Some clinics had them, some had none. Some had the medication that could be given to expectant mothers to prevent their unborn babies from getting malaria. Some clinics had run out. So if you saw our story from Ghana, we featured a young mother who had walked, several hours to the clinic, very pregnant, to get the medication that she counted on to protect her unborn child from malaria, and they didn't have any. So she had to walk home, not knowing whether or not she would get that medicine. So those were the kind of situations that we saw and heard about over and over again in our reporting, which was, again, focused a lot on malaria and maternal health in that particular region. We also went to Kenya. If you didn't have a chance to see those stories, I think the next slide is Kenya. Or if you did, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we did there, was to look at what a lot of people will argue is USAID's one of the most significant and successful programs, which has been PEPFAR. If you don't know about it, it's the president's emergency program to end the HIV/AIDS epidemic. It was started by President Bush. And it's been hugely successful. I don't know the statistics right now of how many lives PEPFAR has saved, but it's in the millions. And it's been successful because it's been popular because it's been so successful. And PEPFAR is one of those programs where we do have the data. So in countries all over the world, there's a reason we don't hear about massive deaths because of HIV anymore. I mean, certainly it happens. There are communities where it's still a huge problem, but now the treatment has gotten so much better. We're on the cusp of rolling out this incredible new treatment, lenacapavir, and we've made incredible progress as a global community in battling HIV/AIDS. So we went to Kenya because there's been so much success there, and largely USAID was a huge, important partner to a lot of these organizations, many of them local on the ground, to get people the regular medication they need to stay alive. As you know, you can live a long life now living with the virus, but you must take your medication. And so we went to, on the right there, you'll see we went to a couple different places in Kenya, but this particular photo, I believe, is a slum outside of Nairobi. But we also went to a similar setting outside of Mombasa, which is on the east coast of Kenya. And there we looked at how, again, the abrupt cessation of those aid programs, the disruption in the distribution of the life-saving medications, ARVs, had impacted communities where there are very high rates of HIV and people are on regular medication. And there are very robust community programs in these areas that are pretty amazing to see. I didn't know anything about this before I did this story. I think like a lot of Americans who I'd never reported on this kind of global health issue, with decades of history and science, that community health programs have been so critical to stemming the tide of HIV, really going into communities, teaching people about reproductive health and safety, offering young women ages 18 to 24, one of the largest growing at-risk populations for HIV because of gender-based violence. I had no idea. And so when we went to these communities in Kenya, what we found was that because of the End of USAID, the medication in some cases was still there, but running out. So there was a lot of unnecessary panic. In some parts of the country, it had not come. And so people were not able to access their medication. And people did unnecessarily lose their lives because they didn't have access to the medication. So I just want to go back in that story, particularly in Kenya, because, as I said in the beginning, we set out to report on the administration's claim that the way that this was carried out and the decision would not cost any lives, specifically would not cost the lives of any children. And very sadly, as we portrayed in the film, featured the young man on the left there, young boy, Victor, and his family were impacted by HIV. Their mother was infected. So all of the children, when they were born, were also infected. And they had been doing well because of this community-led program, the Tutamajineni Project. I'm not saying it. My Swahili is not good. It was going out into the community and really getting in. If you look at a slum like this, that's not an easy neighborhood to work in. It requires a lot of, boots on the ground, people walking from home to home. We're talking about a place that doesn't have Wi-Fi. People are not on their laptops registering, with the local health clinic. The numbers that we keep to keep these programs alive and well and working and successful was being done by epidemiologists, and a lot of them supported by USAID. So we had this kind of like black hole of data. We couldn't get numbers for how many people had lost access to medication. But anecdotally, one of these first early families we interviewed had lost their younger son, age 11, just a little bit before we arrived in Kenya, because he didn't have access to the regular medication that was keeping him alive, and he contracted tuberculosis and died on that same floor where his brother was sitting. And again, the reason for that is because USAID didn't just give the medications. It wasn't a pills and mouth, shots and arms approach. It was very much develop relationships in the community, go out and do the work and meet people where they are and find out what the needs are. And in a community like this, the need is really getting to the clinic to get the medication. The medication is pretty robustly supplied now globally if there are programs there, but getting there, if you have to walk several hours and you have several children and you have to work to put food on the table and keep them alive, is really challenging. And so in this particular community, USAID have provided them transportation to the clinic once a week to get the refills on the medication that they needed. So that was a particularly tragic story, but it wasn't the only one. This happened all over the world to varying degrees in terms of life-saving aid that had been frozen. So moving on from here, just want to talk about one other program that I mentioned earlier, because a lot of people have asked me, like, if there are stories that stuck with me after this reporting. And it's always hard when you're trying to, like, encapsulate such a massive story on such a global scale. And, you know, I knew going into this, we were just capturing one little sliver of what was happening. And that's really all we could do. And it still took, you know, my whole team at the NewsHour and support from the Pulitzer Center to get this done. But one story that we really only had time to kind of gloss over was one that we spent a whole afternoon with the young women featured in some of these slides here. It was also a PEPFAR program. And again, it was an effort to, you know, keep young women safe from HIV in an environment where a disproportionate number of them are victims of sexual violence, of any kind of violence. And the program not only gave them access to, you know, to some basic health services and education, it also gave them a little bit of economic stimulus and sort of a mentorship program. So the young women engaged in this program, and it was called Dreams, and it was throughout the continent. I mean, I'm not sure if it was also throughout the world. I know it was in several African countries, but the idea was to give young women just a little bit of seed money and some training to start businesses. Like, so some of these women we met, I believe the one on the top right, just remarkable young women who have come back from really horrific circumstances to start their own small businesses, like hair cutting, selling food at the market. And they were provided a safe space in this shelter you can see here. It's very basic, but they were safe. They were safe from violence, from attack. And so that in turn helps them go on to have opportunity, which they otherwise wouldn't have. So we spent an afternoon with them, talking to them about what the end of the program, which was cut with USAID because it was not considered life-saving, meant for them. And I think it's an important story to share, only because when we think about aid as Americans, we often think about, you know, we're dropping food and medicine in places that are just really poor, and we're leaving, and that's really nice, we're really generous, that's that. But what's so important to understand is that the way that the United States has conducted foreign aid, humanitarian assistance, development aid in the world for the past 60 years has been a much more thoughtful approach that has involved, in most places, local community actors and partners, and one that's really thought about how in this region is disease transmitted, or why in this region do people not have access to food, and what can we do for them, not just to give them immediate food, which is important in a humanitarian crisis, but also to say, what can we give them? What knowledge maybe or training can we give them? USAID did a lot of that. What small economic stimulus can we give them to start a cattle market like we featured in another part of Kenya, where that can then grow? And then we're talking again about that domino effect of successful assistance and aid, whereby one of these things then lifts up an entire community. So again, for example, in Kenya, in another part of Kenya, in Isiolo, where we visited, a water project had an incredible impact on the health of children in this very small community, because the water project had made a portion of the land that was otherwise non-arable because of droughts, 5 years of droughts. They could not farm the land, and had given them the water to start a small agricultural project. A very small thing, but had totally transformed this community into women who were able to farm and then sell their goods and not sell charcoal, which is what many of them were doing, which is dangerous and can be destructive to the environment and to people's lung health. had given them then the opportunity to send their kids to school with that little bit of money. Because the kids were in school, they were healthier. So it's this ripple effect that we really, I think, saw on the ground when we were there. And I talk about it because I think it's so hard to understand sometimes what foreign aid, humanitarian aid support really means. And I didn't understand it. And I still don't fully, but it's my hope that with these stories, you get a sense of why we're doing what we're doing. And so I think on the next slide, thank you so much. So I've talked about sort of anecdotally and broadly speaking, the impact of successful aid projects. It's really important to talk about not just the humanitarian piece of this, but also the role of the United States in the world, and why we had a footprint in these countries in this way, right? Working so closely with people on the ground in these communities, building these relationships, hopefully building communities towards some sort of form of self-reliance when they're able to. And there's so many reasons for it, but just to sort of go back over like some of the really important reasons why USAID was supported for 6 decades and did the work that it did. In addition to the humanitarian impact, it's really important to think about the economy. You know, we're a global economy, and we saw what happened during COVID when a virus that started halfway around the world froze our lives for quite a long time and disrupted our economy and put people out of work and made people sick. And so the economic impact of having communities halfway around the world at risk of disease and dire poverty and conflict, those risks can end up like on our doorstep faster than we think, you know? So, you know, you'd like to think that we learned a lot from COVID, but I don't know, given the way this decision was made. We also dismantled quite a bit of the pandemic response team, which was a large part of what USAID did very successfully, especially during the Ebola virus. There's a reason we don't worry about Ebola here. It's because we really helped out with top epidemiologists and teams that we sent over surveillance work to help contain that terrible epidemic in West Africa. Another reason that I just want to touch on that's so important is global security. So this was something I didn't really think about, again, when I thought about, humanitarian aid, and we're just being very generous. The humanitarian aid, the soft power, the development piece of USAID, I began to understand we were doing this reporting. And so, again, just 2 examples from our stories. The regions where we're reporting from, in 2 cases, were communities that were very, very close geographically to areas that are unstable and have, growth of bad actors, terrorist groups, gangs. In the case of our reporting in Isiolo, Kenya, people in the community were saying that, we'd say, well, what are you going to do now that this program is gone? And a lot of the young men who were involved in this program said to us, we're fearful because for us, if we don't have basic needs taken care of, and this program, just what it was giving us was allowing us to take care of a lot of other things that keep our families, alive. If we don't have that, we may have to resort to illegal activities, and we may have to succumb to recruitment by terrorist groups over the border in Somalia, a heartbeat away. And those terrorist groups prey upon the most vulnerable. And so, while it's more difficult to connect and see that connection, it makes sense. It's just basic common sense that if a community is able to send their children to school or to have something to do for a living or put food on their table, they're much less likely to go join a terrorist group that promises them food and some kind of income. And that's what happens all over the world, particularly in the Sahel region of Africa, where we were close to in Ghana, but not in. And that region also has an explosive growth of terrorism, and that impacts us at home. That's something that we need to watch, to keep an eye on. And so having USAID in that area, even in a humanitarian capacity, meant that we had kind of eyes and ears on the ground, if you will. And so from what I heard, what we heard in our reporting was that, there were concerns that with the US stepping away and fewer from the American people, which is the USAID tagline signs, that, bad actors would come in some way and, sort of have a footprint that they didn't have before. So those are just some of the reasons. I'm not sure if I have what I was honest. So I want to leave time for questions, but I talked about this in the beginning, the death toll from the end of these programs. We're just never going to know, period. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the end of these programs also meant cutting a lot of the expertise in particularly epidemiology. It also meant the deletion of a lot of data. So when USAID was shut down, they also shut down the computer systems, or the Doge employees at the time, Elon Musk's team. And that computer system that USAID had a really precious trove of documents, of data for all kinds of different things: disease control, economic development, humanitarian crises, and the impact that had been made, like what had worked and what hadn't. And there were things that didn't work. I'm not someone who will say we did everything perfectly and it should have never been changed. That wasn't at all the argument we're trying to make with this at all. That's not what it was about. Again, it was about the way in which this was done and how it's going to impact us going forward. So all we have now, all we can rely on are modeling studies that some epidemiologists have done. Probably the one most cited is at Boston University, where they've done an impact counter. It ended in December, I believe, of last year, just because kind of felt like enough had been done. Where there's just, again, there's no way we're going to know, because these communities don't have a lot of access to their own forms of data collection, what it will mean to have stopped, in some cases entirely, some of our programs that the US previously did, or what it means to deliver aid, but very differently. So the United States, to be clear, is still engaged in foreign aid. The State Department has a newly formed Bureau of Foreign Assistance. However, it's a very different approach. And so only time will tell us whether, the approach works, what doesn't, but it's very different than what USAID was doing. And so, again, we don't know. We won't know whether enough other actors have come in to fill the gaps that were left by the United States. So far, they have not. And I've continued to do my reporting up until yesterday. I've been on the phone with NGOs in a lot of countries around the world who are trying to help me understand the picture. And I will say that while we have resumed some aid, which is a very good thing, I hope we do more of it, the disruption in services over the past year and a half has had a pretty catastrophic impact. And again, don't have hard numbers for you, but anecdotally, I'm speaking to people in other countries, places where global NGOs like Doctors Without Borders, MSF, or the World Food Program has had to either really step up and respond to crises that have been, left because of the way this was done, or they've had to reduce their aid dramatically because they're not getting as much funding from the US and also from other countries. The US is not the only one. So because of the way that things have transpired in the past year and a half, there's had to be sort of a realignment of a lot of countries' budgets in terms of what they're allocating for aid and defense and everything. So other countries have also pulled back aid. And so we just won't know, for a time. And I want to have time for questions. I guess I would just end on, I don't know if I put the photo on the end of this slide, but maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I think it's, oh yeah. So this is one of my favorite photos of my trip that I took when we were in Ghana. I try and always, I'm kind of a wannabe photographer. And so I always shoot my own photos when I can, and it's, I think, a way for me personally, just to see the resilience in people and human beings, and not just sort of I'm there to collect this story, but then I also kind of want to spend some time seeing how people live. And I really think it's important to make a note of how these stories have been really challenging. And yes, there've been a lot of unnecessary deaths and suffering because of what's happened. But, human beings are very resilient. And I've seen examples of it in a lot of really dire situations where people figure out how to do things on their own. And so I just think it's important to make that point, because, there are a lot of innovative ways to survive, and in these communities that are reliant on aid. So I am hopeful and positive that going forward, things will work out, things will realign, things will get better. And so I think it's important to conclude on that note and to open it up to questions for anybody who has any. You do.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
I think we can take questions. Maybe we can alternate between the in-person and online if there are questions coming in.
Sure, I can start just sharing a comment that someone shared in the chat saying, this is heartbreaking. This is the least pro-life administration it's ever been. That's just a comment, not a question yet. So
We can open up to questions
Heartbreaking.
around the table.
You mentioned that there's a new Office of Foreign Assistance.
Yes.
What has the definition been changed? And do you know what would have happened to the Office of U.S. Office of Foreign Assistance? For instance, if there's there's a locust,
Sure.
USAID would come in as a collaborator.
So it's a very good question about the sort of new model of foreign aid and what we're able to respond to now, and what will happen if something like a catastrophic climate disaster or environmental or
a
preventable disaster like a pandemic or a, yes.
Well, you could see it coming
Mhm.
if you had the clinics.
You
in
have the
place
tools, right?
And the data in place.
Yeah.
You have the geosensing in place. You
Mhm.
can see a lot of
So I don't, I cannot pretend to be an expert on the new Department of Foreign Aid under the State Department, or Bureau of Foreign Aid under the State Department. The way that, as I understand it, they are engaging in foreign aid now is to individually negotiate with countries. I believe over 30 have signed what are called these memorandums of understanding. They are, so again, they're very specifically negotiated with the governments of countries, and they are, I would describe them as, yes, we are still giving aid to countries. Aid is part of the agreement. However, the agreements do also have a component of a transactional quality element to them. So a quid pro quo element. So I think that some of the early ones I've looked at and tried to make a little bit of sense of, and from what I've read, it's again, it's we will give you aid, but we would like access to your critical minerals, for example. So they're calling it, I believe the tagline initially was kind of like America First Foreign Aid. So foreign aid that makes America more prosperous, safer, and healthier, or something like that. And I think that's a contradiction in terms. And I think foreign aid, as I mentioned before, is beneficial to the United States, beneficial to the whole world, that we're all, but so to answer your question, I don't know yet. So it depends on the country. It's very country specific, what they're negotiating going forward. What has been interesting is to see a couple of African countries reject these agreements. Did you say Ghana today?
Ghana this week.
Ghana this week, which I didn't even know, because I think Zimbabwe and one other country, at least Zaire, maybe. And
Sudan.
yeah, so I think that that tells you a lot, because those are countries that need that aid. I'm not an expert on it, so I don't really know. It would be something that I really want to keep an eye on going forward. But again, the idea behind it is, again, very transactional. It's sort of quid pro quo. And it's not about giving the aid to local organizations on the ground. It's about giving the aid to, for example, like large global NGOs, like the Global Fund. We just gave, I think, $2 billion to the Global Fund as a country. That's great. That's very generous. But it's very different from what USAID was doing. Again, a very localized approach, working with community staff on the ground who were local. It's more of a top-down approach. And so my initial concerns about that already are that, do these governments have the capacity to, for example, jointly fund these agreements, as they've pledged in the agreements to jointly perhaps finance some of this aid? Do they even have the funds to do it? Who will hold them accountable? How will they deliver it if they don't have the expertise to do so? We did offer a lot more than just the aid. Again, the expertise, the infrastructure, the institutional knowledge. And so, given that a lot of that has disappeared, one other thing I just wanted to say to your question, though, that's important, is that the State Department has quietly gone back over the past few months and built back a few of the things that were destroyed in the shutdown of USAID. One of those is the rapid response crisis team of USAID. And so I think they learned very quickly, because after USAID was dissolved, there was a horrible earthquake in Myanmar. And it was, I think, pretty embarrassing to be caught not only flat-footed, but several people from the agency who were responding and saving lives in the midst of the aftermath of that earthquake were fired while they were doing the work. And I think that was really bad publicity. I hate to say that that's what it took, but they have built back a little bit of that. So if there is a catastrophic whatever, and they've also said they've built back pandemic response, but from what I'm hearing from people, it's still kind of a shadow of what it was before. So that does concern me when it comes to preventable pandemics and disease and things like that. Hope that answers your question.
Do we have any questions
We
from the
do.
virtual world?
Yes. So, thank you for the thoughtful presentation. In journalism, how do you approach working with local journalists who have expertise on these topics to bring in local knowledge and expertise? Are they part of the team? Are they part of the team and compensated? Also, how do you approach disrupting stereotypes about aid and poverty on the continent of Africa when reporting?
Oh, those are two big questions, but they're really good ones. Well, the first question, the answer is I would love to work more with local reporters, because particularly with this story, my initial hope was that I could work with reporters all over. And so I had reached out to some in various countries to say, like, is there a way we can work together? Unfortunately, it's just hard with the business model of the media in the United States to be able to have the funds to support, a whole team of reporters. So I would like to work more with local journalists, especially with this story, because I feel like it is really hard to, we did this reporting with the help of, local fixers, but they weren't reporters. It was just people who could help us thoughtfully, enter a community, earn their trust, understand what their problems and challenges were, and do so with an amount of trust that is required to do the reporting. So I wish I could work with more journalists. I think we're all, working for the same reasons. And it's really important to have the perspectives on the ground, especially right now when we have like whole news deserts. We don't know really what is happening now in Afghanistan, in Gaza, in DRC. Like, we sort of do, but those intrepid reporters that go in or are local and report from there are so essential. Like, they do incredible work that I'm completely in awe of. So I wish we could work more with them, because right now, as I continue to report these stories, I'm having a lot of trouble getting information from a lot of countries, Somalia, Yemen, places where they're really catastrophic humanitarian issues. Haiti is another one where journalists have been, constantly attacked. And so it's very hard to do that work without the help of locals. I think they're really, in the past year, have been like the unsung heroes of the journalism world. And the second part of the question was about,
how do you approach disrupting stereotypes about aid and poverty on the continent of Africa when reporting?
That is such a good question. It's one I struggle with a lot. And I think it would be like hubris to say that I have an answer. Like, I try my best. And the way that I feel, I think it's very easy to fall into those stereotypes of, oh, just another story about another poor community or war-afflicted community on the continent of Africa. There is a total kind of, I don't even know if that people sort of think they already know the story, and therefore they don't pay attention. They don't understand. They don't even understand, most people, that the continent is made up of, over 50 countries. Like, it's massive. They're completely different issues. So I'm very aware of it all the time. I also think it's so dangerous and unhelpful to just go into a community and make people look like victims and like, oh, you just relied on USAID and now these poor people are just going to suffer again. Goodbye. Like, what I think we tried to do in these stories were, first of all, like, my only two answers are always make it about the voices of the people in the story. So I'm not going there to stand there and tell you this is what's happening. We're going to talk to the people in the community, the farmers, the mothers, the teachers, the clinic workers, and hear it from them and give them a voice. Like, that's what I try to do. And the other thing is to approach the stories always with like a huge amount of humility. Like, I am so lucky to be here right now and have this community trust me with their story. And so I think sometimes, like, there is a victim mentality of like reporting kind of the victim falling into that trope. And I think it's easy in those circumstances to do that. And again, I can't say I have the answer and I do it really well. I try my best. I'm very aware of it when I'm doing it. It's to really, again, respect people, meet them where they are on the same level. Like, I'm just a journalist. You're a human being and you're the one who has a story to tell. It's the best I can do, I guess. And make sure that we have, somebody local with us to not just to translate, but also to help us get around, to know where the problems are, to help us with like some context that we may otherwise not get because we don't speak whatever the language or dialect may be. And I think that's really important, is to do a lot of pre-reporting and research and not just kind of parachute in to a place without knowing as much as you possibly can about the way people live. I mean, it's the best we can do.
Is there a question from the table? Second.
Thank you so much. And I think I have more of a logistical question
Yeah.
about how you do this international reporting.
Mm.
So you mentioned that source cooperation was difficult. How did you identify on the ground sources and what made cooperation?
So finding sources when you're not on the ground and you're half the world away is extremely difficult. And I've done stories halfway around the world before, but I've never done a story where this was turned out to be much more investigative than I thought it would be, because people were so reluctant to talk. The reasons for this are just like myriad reasons, but the main ones, I guess, would be one, the administration had explicitly told people with the agency, even though they'd already been terminated, they were not allowed to talk to the media and they would face repercussions. They didn't specify what those would be, but and no, I don't think that's legal. But that was, a lot of things were happening at a very rapid pace, and people were very scared to speak out in those early days, not just at USAID, but all the federal agencies that were, faced significant cuts. So that was really difficult. I think the other reason people were reluctant to talk is that our main source of information on the ground were NGOs, nonprofits, organizations that were working on the ground, had lost all their funding or a vast majority of it, because the United States had pulled out so quickly, but hoped that if they just kept their heads down and kept doing their work, the funding would come back. And of course, I hoped that for them too. So it was difficult to press people to say, listen, unless you tell me the story and we share it with the world, we as a journalistic global community report on what's happening on the ground because of this decision, nothing will change. However, for them, it was, if we do talk, it was a terribly conflicted situation for everybody to be in. If we don't talk, nobody will know the true fact about what's happening on the ground. But if we do talk, we may never get the aid that we hope we're going to get if we're just quiet and keep doing our work. So it was really difficult. I am very grateful to Signal because it allowed me to work with a lot of anonymous sources. And so once I got the word out that I was doing the reporting, I did a lot of work on LinkedIn, which was funny to me because I've never used really LinkedIn other than to just sort of update my own profile and to look at a couple things. But I realized pretty quickly that, tens of thousands of people had been fired. So where are they going to go? I mean, a lot of them just wanted nothing to do with any of it anymore, but a lot of them were looking for a job in the aid community and had posted details online about working at USAID and what they had done. So I went to LinkedIn, spent the money on a very expensive premium membership, short term. I think I got the free one and then of course forgot to cancel it and charge. So if LinkedIn wants to reimburse me, that would be great. But I spent a lot of time on LinkedIn trying to get people saying, hey, they were too afraid to even respond on LinkedIn. But what I would do is always put my Signal in my signature and say, if you would like to talk off the record confidentially, here's how you can contact me. And so people would reach out to me saying, not going to give you my name, but I am A.H. in, I don't know, South Sudan. And I would like to tell you about what is happening here. That's how we ended up getting some breaks and getting people to talk to us. But it was hard. And in one of those stories from Kenya, we featured someone with USAID anonymously, which is not really something that the PBS NewsHour does very frequently. Like you may see it a lot on, like crime shows or Dateline or something where they have the blurred face and voice, but we don't is in at PBS, there's not a whole lot of that on the nightly news. So that was a little, but it's really was the only way that we could protect someone from USAID. Nobody wanted to be the person appearing on national television in the United States saying, yes, children are dying because of this, because sources were being intimidated. If you think about all the early whistleblowers when these agencies were being demolished, they faced a lot of intimidation and threat. And it was very scary, actually, for people. Their lives were disrupted by speaking out terribly, and their families were threatened. So you always like walk that balance of, I want to protect you, but also please help us tell this story somehow.
We have time for a
Yes, we have 3 more questions.
Oh my
I'm not
God.
sure that we have time for all of them, but
Okay, I'll try and be quick.
Can private entities such as NGOs take up the role that USAID had, or are NGOs too small for that task?
They're trying. A lot of NGOs are trying to fill the void. They're too small. This was massive amounts of money, even though for the United States it was a pretty small amount, given how wealthy a nation we are, but it was still a lot of money. And there just aren't NGOs that can really step in to fill the void. I mean, I will say a lot of them are doing extraordinary work. I mean, the fundraising that kicked into high gear, the people that worked around the clock after these programs were closed and shuttered to find funding and get creative. Talked to a woman who used to be with USAID, who started like matching programs, life-saving programs that were cut with potential donors. That kind of work is so amazing. And so there have been successful efforts, but it's just too large of a gap right now. And local governments also, as much as we'd like to say, you know, the goal of aid is to work ourselves, like the United States, out of a job on the ground and have this country support itself, they also don't have the funds. You know, a lot of these countries where we worked. So the answer is unfortunately no.
Fair. I'll read one more and then we can go to the question in the room. Okay. In a time of polarization and short attention spans, what gives you optimism that thoughtful storytelling will still build empathy and deep understanding, inspire people to care about lives beyond their own borders?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm optimistic right now about storytelling in longer form, thoughtful storytelling, because it's become so hard. We are now a quick bite attention audience right now. People are getting their stories like this on the click of their phones, and people have supposedly short attention spans. I think my glass half full view of this is that we've got such a messy media landscape right now that I know this sounds naive, but that there will be like a rebalancing of the way people are consuming media. And I think that we've seen over the past few years how dangerous this kind of fast clip, I don't even know if you can call it journalism, but a lot of the social media accounts that sort of people say they're act as journalists and put out mis and disinformation, things like, you know, Twitter X. Those are just, you know, often really not reliable sources for news. And so I think that people are beginning to realize the dangers of this, and there's maybe a little bit more of a swing back towards more thorough, thoughtful, informed storytelling. That's my hope. But I would be lying if I said I weren't very concerned about the kind of journalism that I like to do and the shrinking resources for it and the challenges I face in doing it and trying to get these stories done, which is like a constant uphill battle. It's like 1,000 phone calls before I get a yes. So I feel it intensely.
one more question from the room. We can take one.
Yes.
Was it really so abrupt? Or was this part of a plan in the larger vision of what people are calling MAGA?
Yeah.
I mean, was it part of their plan, or did it really creep up so fast? It was the first agency to go.
It was the first agency to go. So the question is whether this was a broader part of the of, you know, Trump's bases movement
Or other
strengthening.
Someone else, even
Sure.
from the
Yeah.
who wanted to change.
So yes, I mean, I will just say that during the first Trump administration, they left USAID alone, and the administrator, Mark Green, was a Republican appointee and
Wisconsin.
was he from Wisconsin? Very popular and a huge supporter of the programs and wonderful lead of the agency. So I will say that what happened with the destruction of USAID was a very deliberate first act of destruction, if you will, like opening salvo in the beginning of the war on federal agencies. I think that it was deliberate in that they knew it was low-hanging fruit because they could demolish these programs and half a world away, nobody would be able to tell what was going on or scream about it. And if they did, they just wouldn't be heard. And that's part of what motivated my storytelling. But I do not believe that Americans will look back on this period and say we made the majority of Americans, we made the right decision, because Republicans, as you know, were huge supporters of USAID. Secretary of State himself spent years championing the very programs that he then, the buck stops at him, oversaw the destruction of. And he allowed Elon Musk and his team to go in and do it. I don't know why it happened so quickly and so chaotically and overnight, which ended up being totally inefficient and caused them huge headaches now that they're trying to rebuild foreign assistance and pay back, all sorts of legal fees and left equipment. And it's a total mess, I do not think that part was deliberate. And I don't think that the MAGA base really had any knowledge of what was going on. I think they let Elon Musk and his team go rogue. That's what I think. There were some masterminds behind it. So Pete Morocco was the big one. Russ Vogt, who wants to cut, so much of the federal government. Maybe Stephen Miller had a hand in it because of his worldview, but those are just some of the players that I think, to answer your question, don't enjoy popular support for that kind of destruction.
Is any other collaborating country that used to provide aid following suit and doing this as well?
Well, yes, they're cutting aid. I mean, across the board, it's a trend of a massive decrease in aid around the world because of what I said before, which is that it's not really, there has been a domino effect. So aid exists in an ecosystem, just like in biology. If you cut off one part of that ecosystem, the rest can't really flourish. So everybody was working in concert, particularly in these high-risk environments. So if you cut the funding for one piece of this program, it makes it very hard for the others to exist successfully. So there's been a domino effect, but there's also been a reallocation of resources because of the shift, certainly in the geopolitical, particularly in Europe, having to reallocate resources to defense budgets, for example, because of what's happening in Ukraine and Iran. Now there's even more of a drawdown because countries have had to reallocate, reassess how they're going to respond to these kind of global, earth-shattering events like war that is unexpected. And so overall, the aid sector is in a massive sort of shape-shifting, I guess, moment, but a lot of countries, Germany, England, all of them have had to significantly scale back aid, unfortunately.
I think I have a pretty quick question to get out of the way with the last one here. So someone here is asking, I'm curious if you have presented your reporting to key figures in the State Department, such as Special Envoy Charles Carter or Jeremy Lewin, Undersecretary of Foreign Assistance, Humanitarian Affairs, and Religious Freedom.
I would welcome the opportunity to sit down with either of those people. I have heard, in particular, Jeremy Lewin, who is, I believe, the head of the Bureau at this time, speak very recently. I believe it was at one of the think tanks in Washington, D.C., talking about their new approach to foreign aid. And what I'm hearing from my reporting and what our investigations on the ground tells me is very different from what they're putting forward. So I would welcome the opportunity to do so. I don't know if they're aware of our reporting. And I do know that there are several, lawmakers who have been unsuccessfully trying to lobby Congress. I say unsuccessfully because early on there were some lawmakers who really demanded hearings. There were some USAID whistleblower, very brave people who came forward and talked about the impact, but it didn't seem to move the needle, unfortunately. So, that was much more courageous than my reporting. So, I would love to have the opportunity, and I hope to one day have the chance to ask them if they still stand by the statement that no one has died because of the cuts.
What a way to end it.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Molly.
You're welcome. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you
all your thoughtful questions and for hosting me.
If there are any others, we may be able to answer them afterwards.
Of course.
And thank you to the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting and our Pulitzer Center Campus Consortium here for bringing you to campus and to Madison. So thank you to our partners. One final thing, I believe there is a survey the Pulitzer Center would like participants to complete. I think we have those details online.